When you look at the population of every major MMORPG and notice that every one of them has seen its player base decline over the last 10 years, except for 2, it makes you stop and wonder, what are the declining MMOs doing wrong, and what are the growing MMOs doing right? What about the long-reigning king of the genre, World of Warcraft? It's public knowledge that it's been bleeding players for a long time, and yet you can tell there are so many players hoping each expansion will be the one that hooks them yet again. Each expansion creates a massive mountain of interest, whereas other MMOs are only generating molehills. Then there's Elder Scrolls Online. It suffered a near-fatal launch, but committed to fixing the game's major bugs and dropped the requirement on its subscription to lure players back in. Since then, the game has had some good years and some bad years, and it's held on to a respectable number of players, but the trend is definitely there. It has been on the decline, especially in the last year. Guild Wars 2, same thing. Another massively successful MMO trending down over the long run. Though it is worth noting, over the last 2 years, this game has reversed course on that trend and is actually seeing some growth. Not surprising, this game did a lot of things right in recent expansions between its mounts, its story, and its zone exploration, and what feels like a renewed focus on the game itself by the developers in recent years. If we look at RuneScape, same thing. It's been bleeding players and interest for a long time now, still holding on to a very respectable player base size, but definitely trending down. While these are some of the biggest games bleeding players, the trend isn't unique to these games, it's across the entire genre. Let's take a look at a few more. Black Desert Online, Terra, Destiny 2, EverQuest 2, Lord of the Rings Online, Ion, SWTOR. You can pick almost any MMO out there, and the graph is going to look almost exactly the same. Interestingly, there's only 2 games that escape this trend, and they couldn't be more different from one another, and that's Final Fantasy XIV and old school RuneScape. When I see something like this, it always makes me wonder. When I look at something thriving where everything else is struggling to survive and even dying, I want to know why. I have hundreds and sometimes thousands of hours in almost every MMO I mentioned so far. So in this video, let's start by taking a look at what Final Fantasy XIV does differently. Final Fantasy XIV is a buy and then sub to play MMO that gives you 60 levels for free to get the hooks in you. Right off the bat, this is a great and confident approach to monetization. You don't have to commit a dime to the game until you know you love it. Personal preference aside, there literally is no reason not to give it a try. Then, if you do decide that you enjoy it, the mandatory sub that you're paying allows them to avoid the pitfalls that come with free-to-play games like pay to win, pay for convenience, and the general cannibalism of content that free-to-play games experience as they place all their chase items in the cash shop. Let me explain. Some people say that subscription-based MMOs are history. But first, speaking of history, Rise of Kingdoms is the sponsor of today's video. Rise of Kingdoms is a history-based strategy game with 13 different civilizations to choose from, like Roman, Viking, or Egyptian. Each civilization excels in different stats based on their historical background and has commanders to pair up with your army. With over 100 million downloads, the developers have decided to expand to PC so that you can enjoy this great game on a bigger screen with smoother, real-time strategy PC controls. Hundreds of players can participate in battles on screen at once, and now on PC it looks better and smoother than ever before. All the battles are happening in real time on the map, and anyone can join or leave the battle at any time. You can select troops by dragging your mouse and then send them off to battle with a right click, just like a PC strategy game. You can join alliances with up to 140 players and compete with other alliances for control of valuable resources to make your empire stronger. Outsmart your enemies whenever you can. If you see an ally being attacked, it's your call to defend them or to fire off a surprise counterattack on the enemy. There is no limit to the strategy you can use to defeat your enemies, so support my channel by downloading the game from my link in the description or scan the QR code on screen right now for the mobile version. You can also get a special bonus on PC if you use code PLAYROK for PC. Have fun building your empire in Rise of Kingdoms. Let's get back to it. I think the subscription model has turned out to be one of Final Fantasy XIV's best selling points. Not the fact that you have to pay $12 a month to play it, but the fact that you don't have to spend another dime beyond that. In return, you get a finished product, which is incredibly rare these days. Final Fantasy XIV does not engineer problems so that they can sell you the solution. And in 2022, that's honestly such a massive breath of fresh air that does not go unnoticed by the average player today. We are so used to trudging through games that are built with obvious, avoidable flaws put in the game to extract money from us. A lot of times we don't spend the money out of principle or frugality, and we endure this inconvenience or the next one until we decide not to anymore. and we quit. Then there's the expansions themselves. Final Fantasy expansions are massive and actually worth getting excited about. The money the game is making is being poured back into the game. You can see it. In the last year alone, Final Fantasy XIV had the Endwalker expansion that came with a ton of new zones, not one but two new classes, and a ton of new dungeons, trials, and raids, and an enormous amount of earnable weapon skins, mount skins, armor skins, and pets. On top of all of that, every quarter or so, Final Fantasy gets another patch for free that is often as big as other MMOs' annual expansions. This year they included things like quests, dungeons, raids, and an entire new housing island system, and a slew of earnable cosmetics. Now, when you compare this to what other major MMOs are adding, the difference is very noticeable. SWTOR's most recent expansion added about 2 hours of story content on each side, in a game that is most known for its story content. ESO's newest expansion added a new zone and a raid and a card game. BDO added a new zone and a new class. Guild Wars actually had a respectable expansion with a new class spec for every class, new zones, and a new mount type, but it took 3 years to come out. WoW's expansions are the only ones that come close in terms of size and scope, with Dragonflight adding a new class, a new race, and a new class of mount among their other usual additions like multiple new zones, dungeons, and raids. Again, when you look at what each of these MMOs is adding year over year, it's easy to see why some keep players coming back more than others. The MMOs without mandatory subscriptions are really struggling in terms of content additions and enjoyable time sinks. Their expansions are smaller and the number of earnable weapons and mount cosmetics are generally non-existent, which means players have a lot less to do, so they get bored sooner and leave sooner. So begins the unstoppable cycle of fewer people spending money in the cash shop, which means the developers have to crank up monetization while cutting back on the scope of expansions even more, further expediting the decline of their population. We have seen it so many times, and we're seeing it again in almost every non-sub MMO today. Final Fantasy XIV did not concede its sub despite its disastrous launch, and I think that it owes a lot of its success today to that. If Final Fantasy XIV was just another game where you paid for the best cosmetics, paid for the best weapons, and paid for the best mounts, and then paid for convenience on top of all of that, I think it too would be experiencing the same decline in interest as the rest of the genre. MMO developers figured out that they could make more money in the short term if they sold the coolest things in the cash shop, and now they are realizing that they make a lot less money in the long term if they put all of the coolest things in the cash shop. Saying that monetizing all of the best cosmetics in an MMO is better than going full pay to win is like saying jumping off of a high rise is better than jumping out of an airplane. You're killing your game either way, one is just faster than the other. It's incredibly simple. As soon as an MMO starts asking how it can make more money out of players before they quit, instead of asking what experience and rewards they can add to keep them around, the cycle has begun. The cannibalism of content by the cash shop has begun. The decline of the MMO is inevitable because the core philosophy of the MMO is being eroded. The goal of the developer has shifted from retain the player to get the player to spend money in the cash shop. Explore, kill, loot doesn't work if the cool loot is in the cash shop. Why should you explore and kill? The developer is now trying to sell you your rewards rather than encouraging you to go out and earn them. Almost all of the dying MMOs today suffer from a much more obvious problem. Western audiences don't like pay to win and don't seem to stick around long when too much of the game's monetization model is based on pay for convenience, which, if we're being honest, often ends up drifting all the way into pay to win. For a long time, WoW did what Final Fantasy XIV is doing before Final Fantasy XIV did it. WoW was adding tons of content. WoW was adding tons of earnable cosmetics, tons of earnable mounts, and earnable pets. So what changed for WoW? WoW was once a sub-to-play MMO with all the best cosmetics earned in-game and no pay to win. It was the biggest MMO of all time, but WoW changed. It started making some of the best cosmetics and some of the best mounts cash shop items.
You did something unforgivable. You released a mount? And not just any mount. Not just a horse. Not a bear. But the mount. The Celestial Steed.
It also added WoW tokens, which unfortunately is really just a fancy way to say pay to win. Exchanging real-world money for in-game items and currency is the definition of pay to win. WoW tokens are probably the single most complained about feature in the entire game, and literally every player saw that coming. The only reason adding WoW tokens didn't do more damage faster is that they weren't added until 2015, when many players had sunk a decade of their lives into the game and they didn't see an immediately compelling option to switch over to. To be fair, WoW isn't the only MMO to make this mistake, but it is certainly the biggest MMO to fall into this trap. ESO has a similar feature with crowns, where the developers sanctioned players buying in-game gold with cash as long as they use crowns to do it. Same thing in Guild Wars 2, you can exchange in-game currency for cash shop currency and vice versa. The problem with this is now every item in the game has real-world value. Every item you can earn, someone else can buy. It devalues player achievements and demotivates them from seeking out more. More importantly, it condenses an entire day, week, or month's worth of memories into a forgettable 15-second card swipe. Here's Asmongold distilling down the leveling process in an MMO that allows you to exchange cash for currency.
Step 1, get a job. Step 2, get your paycheck from the job. Step 3, use your money to buy a boost to level 70. Step 4, pay somebody else to boost you through dungeons to level 80. Step 5, buy gold. Step 6, go to a Naxxramas GDKP. Step 7, bid on all of the gear into GDKP and get full gear. Step 8, pay for an arena carry. And step 9, buy BOE gear. Step 10, finally, now you can play the game.
These are 3 of Final Fantasy XIV's biggest competitors, and they all caved on this topic, and I honestly believe it's a large part of the answer as to why Final Fantasy XIV thrives while they bleed players. It's a death of 1,000 cuts by monetization. First, it was just a random mount. Then it was all the best mounts. First, it was an armor set. Then it was all the best armor sets. First, it was failing to ban RMTers, and then it was condoning RMT through the cash shop currencies. Final Fantasy XIV just has the purest monetization of the bunch, and as a result has held onto the core MMO experience of explore, kill, and loot to make your character as powerful and as awesome looking as possible. If we look at the more pay-to-win games, their decline is even more sharp. It's almost as if there's a direct correlation between the amount of pay to win and the speed at which your game becomes irrelevant here in the West. Obviously, Western players don't like pay to win, and sanctioning buying gold with real money is sanctioning pay to win. It's done. The game now contains a significant form of pay to win, and it's a genie that can't be put back in the bottle. Well, I suppose they could, but I doubt they will. The accountants don't see the money they are not making because of it, they only see the money they are making because of it. It's hard to prove a negative. When they make less money this year than they did last year, they don't see it as being due to their over monetization pushing players away, they see it as the result of their under monetizing the players that are left. Incredible. The damage done by WoW tokens, crowns, and gems for gold doesn't stop there. The economy no longer needs to be based on what a player can afford in-game. It becomes in part based on how much gold they can afford to buy out of game with their credit card. Inflation goes nuts, and a new player enters the game looking at unreasonable prices and is left with 2 options: buy gold with cash or grind out a now inflated amount of gold for themselves, neither of which is terribly appealing. Final Fantasy XIV, on the other hand, still puts all the best rewards in game and does not sanction the ability to turn those into cash transactions. Instead, it would rather you go out and earn it, and just like that, the player has something to do when they log in. Alright, the next item on the list is going to be the content itself. First, let's talk about the solo experience. Final Fantasy XIV was built for the solo player, but not at the expense of the group player. It is a highly curated journey from start to finish, built with the short attention span of today's MMO player in mind. There's not a moment that the game isn't leading you by the hand to the next objective. It's always there in the top left corner, ushering you to the next plot point. There is a continuous 10-year story woven through the game seamlessly. This achieves 2 things. 1, the new player never signs in and finds themselves unsure of what to do next. They always have an objective. It's worth noting that they can deviate from this path if they want to. There's plenty of horizontal content, optional trials, optional dungeons, and even optional jobs to level, but the player can also choose the on-rails experience and soak up that main story. The second thing is the quality of the story. It's amazingly written with twists, turns, and jaw-dropping backstabs, complete with music and cutscenes. It's not perfect, nothing is. It's got way too many dialogue boxes, in my opinion, that really serve to age the MMO. But the story those dialogue boxes tell is so good that it keeps players moving forward. And for the players that choose to skip the dialogue boxes, the cutscenes do a good job of presenting the key plot points so that they are mostly able to follow along as well. Final Fantasy XIV focuses on delivering a masterfully told story, which is something a lot of MMOs treat as optional when it's really not. A good story, fantastic lore, it's critical to any great RPG. While Final Fantasy XIV is an RPG MMO, emphasis on the RPG first, it is no slouch when it comes to group content. This is another thing Final Fantasy XIV handles brilliantly. Most MMO players today are solo players, and if the MMO they are playing does not do a good job of introducing them to dungeons or trials and other group content, they simply won't participate in that content. The story in Final Fantasy XIV consistently and seamlessly sends players into group content. Many of the dungeons are part of the story and must be completed to proceed with the story. Same with many of the trials. The difficulty on this content is tuned down to what we'll call story mode difficulty, but it still serves to introduce every single player to that type of content. And once there, many find that they enjoy it and begin to pursue it horizontally. They deviate from the story to seek out the optional trials, the optional raids, for the fun of completing them, but also for the incredible rewards and cosmetics that can be earned inside. So despite being a solo MMO through and through, Final Fantasy XIV ends up having every member of the community participate in a ton of group content content every expansion. This means you can always find a group for any dungeon, trial, or raid in the game. Level scaling ensures that it will always be fun, and there won't be one person in the group killing everything and trivializing the content while you struggle to keep up. I think other MMOs should recognize the success of Final Fantasy XIV's approach to dungeons and specifically trials. You spawn in front of a boss and you can already tell 100% of the developers' time and effort are put into this one fight. There are no boring trash pulls to wade through over and over, no filler DPS sponge side bosses with low effort mechanics, no long runs back when you wipe. You just spawn in front of the boss, the final act. There are boss transformations, stage transformations, music changes, and cutscenes. It's a cinematic experience as well as a mechanically heavy experience with multiple levels of difficulty so that you can choose how hard you want it to be. And if you do choose the hardest difficulties, there are great rewards for your efforts. The trials are great bite-sized group content that I always look forward to because they're a spectacle and they're fun. Some other MMOs are noticing. It looks like Guild Wars 2 has been inspired by these trials in its strike missions recently, and I think more MMOs would benefit from focusing on this quick, high-intensity, mechanic-heavy group content. All thriller, no filler, get in, get out. It works and it works well. There just aren't enough people that want to devote 2 to 6 hours of their day to struggling through a raid anymore. Final Fantasy XIV's trials are the best part of that raid experience, the final fight and its loot. And none of the filler that leads up to that. Anyways, these are the things that I noticed when I played Final Fantasy XIV. The game launched horribly. They shut it down, and perhaps the best decision they made was to not give up the subscription model. By retaining that, they ensured that they could continue to outdo themselves from one expansion to the next. They were able to continue to give players great in-game rewards for their achievements, rather than locking them all in a cash shop. They were able to crank the cinematic spectacles to 11 on the group content, and I think that's something a lot of MMOs forget. Raids, trials, and dungeons, they should be spectacles in 2022 and beyond. No one is impressed by running through a cave and killing things along the way anymore. Those days are over. Developers have to think beyond that. Give us stage transformations, give us boss transformations, give us epic soundtracks, and if you won't, Final Fantasy XIV will. Final Fantasy XIV isn't perfect. It's not a one-size-fits-all MMO. The art style is hit and miss for a lot of players. Some people are never going to be okay with a flying car pulling up next to them in their fantasy MMO. The base game has way too many dialogue boxes that make it feel old compared to modern RPGs. The questing experience is definitely carried by the story. There's literally almost zero combat while questing. It's mostly talking to one NPC and then the next until you unlock a dungeon or a trial. But when you do get a solo duty or a dungeon or a trial, it's amazing. Zone exploration is not as good as it is in other MMOs. The most exciting thing that you might find is an Aether Current. There is next to no reason to interact with mobs in Overland content. It's almost always better to leash them and then talk to the NPC that they were standing next to, which is rough on immersion. And finally, if you're new to the game, you're gonna have to spend a lot of hours working through the story alone before you can spend any significant amount of time with your friends. But despite all of this, Final Fantasy XIV is one of only 2 MMOs that fall into S tier for me. I absolutely love it, but I also recognize its shortcomings. It's exciting to imagine an MMO that does what Final Fantasy XIV does well while improving on what it does not. I think there's absolutely room for another big MMO to succeed alongside Final Fantasy XIV and to even surpass it. There is so much to be learned from its success and from the failure of its peers. For the sake of the genre, I just hope future MMOs are paying attention. As for the future MMOs, if your plan is to build an incredibly inconvenient MMO and sell us the convenience, if your plan is to try to sell a pay-to-win MMO in the West, if your plan is to be an MMO with all the best cosmetics locked in the cash shop rather than earned, well, you just haven't been paying attention. If you're still here, hopefully you enjoyed the video, so be sure to like and subscribe for more MMO content. And a massive shout out for my YouTube members for supporting the channel. If you want to become a YouTube member, click the join button below. And if you're not sure what to do next, maybe check out one of the videos popping up on screen right now. This video ran long, so I'm gonna have to break the discussion of old school RuneScape into the next video. Be sure to subscribe so you're alerted when I post it.